Well, thank you. Thank you all. And thank you, Glenn, for being here. We really appreciate it. All right, well, we'll get right to it because I know people have been sitting for a while. The question everybody has on their mind after watching this film, what's up with the dogs? I mean, how many dogs do you own?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were clearly the star of the show. I think they stole every scene they were in. I was still a little bit bitter about that. We rescue a lot of dogs. We foster a lot of dogs in addition to the ones we have. So at the time of the film, there were 13. And I think there are now 17. So they're multiplying.
Wow. Okay. All right. Dog lovers. You have fans. So, all right. So it's been about 3 years now since this happened. What's the latest with Edward Snowden? What's his situation now? Do you know?
I do know. We speak very frequently, and we'll be speaking actually tomorrow at this public event that we're doing with Professor Noam Chomsky, who I've heard rumors is actually here. Yes, that rumor is now confirmed. So we speak very often, and I think it's hard to explain that. To express how when we were doing the scenes that you saw in the film, when we were in the hotel in Hong Kong, we thought really almost with certainty that he would very shortly be in American custody and spend, if not the rest of his life in prison, at least the next several decades in prison. That was just the working assumption that we all had, which is one of the things that made what he did so heroic, was he was just prepared to do that. And so anything that's not that's not him sitting in a cage in the United States, incommunicado, is a huge improvement. And although he didn't choose to be in Russia, he's free to travel within Russia. And much more importantly, he has become a really important voice in the debate, the global debate that he triggered. He writes articles, he gives speeches, he attends events like the one we're doing tomorrow. He has a really active presence on Twitter, which drives the NSA absolutely crazy. That he just sort of like tweets these snarky little thoughts that he has, as though he's just some sort of like 14-year-old, when as opposed to the world's most pursued fugitive. But it is such a positive outcome. Given what we thought was likely to happen, and he's doing great. His longtime girlfriend has now moved there with him. His family visits, and he lives, I wouldn't say a regular, normal life, but something much closer to it than we ever thought possible.
Okay. I guess patriot seems to be the presiding mood here over traitor. I don't know. So what ramifications did all this have? What effects did it make any difference? The revelations that you all put forth.
Yeah, they've made a huge difference. And this is the question I am most frequently have posed to me whenever I appear at events like this. And sometimes the undercurrent to the question is, well, obviously it made a huge news story. It created this really intense debate. But has anything really changed? I mean, after all, the NSA building is still standing. The doors are still open. They're still spying. And the assumption of the question, and to the extent it intends to imply that not all that much has changed, is that not all that much has changed in terms of laws that the U.S. government passed to limit their own spying power. And when we were in Hong Kong and we were envisioning what we hoped to achieve, having the U.S. government pass a bunch of laws banning itself from spying was not something that we were thinking of, because governments don't walk around and think about how to limit their own power. We were hoping the change would take place in other realms, and I think it has. For one thing, this story became a massive story, not just in the United States, but in dozens of countries on essentially every continent in the world, to the point where I can still travel to almost any country, and if I appear at an event to speak about these things, large auditoriums will be filled because the interest level is so high. And when you trigger a global debate like that, for the first time, a debate about what is the value of privacy in the digital age, and what is the danger of government secrecy, and what is the proper role of journalism in a democracy, and a whole variety of related questions. What is the role that the United States plays in the world? just changing consciousness that way has really enduring ramifications. Beyond that, we ruptured a lot of diplomatic relations that the United States has with various governments around the world, to the point where those governments are now actively still working to prevent U.S. hegemony over the internet. Perhaps even larger than that is that millions of individuals, literally, who for the first time realized the extent to which their privacy has been compromised, are now using encryption and taking steps to protect their own privacy, which is a huge impediment to allowing the US government and its partners to maintain a surveillance state. And then probably the biggest change, and you see this in the big news story about the conflict between the FBI on the one hand and Apple on the other, is that before we did all this reporting, all of these Silicon Valley companies very actively collaborated with the NSA. They turned over all of your data whenever the NSA asked. Facebook and Apple and Google and Yahoo and Microsoft. And now, the reason why they did that is because they were able to do it in the dark. There were no costs, no ramifications to it because nobody knew they were doing it. Once we shined a light on the extent to which that collaboration was taking place, they perceived that it was very threatening to their future business prospects because they knew that people around the world weren't going to want to use US social media companies if they thought that they were going to hand over their data to the NSA. And so these companies now realize, not because they care about your privacy, they do not at all any more than they did before, but what they do care about is that you continue to use their services, and they believe that for you to do that, they have to show you and show people around the world who now care about privacy that they're serious about protecting your privacy, that they're willing to embed technology in their products and stand up to the US government. And this is an enormous sea change that has been and that has become a really big barrier to enable the US to continue what it's doing.
Good point. So, the film tactfully said at the beginning that there was a kind of a communication delay between you and Snowden, and mainly it sounded like you didn't want to mess with all this encryption software, and it seemed a little complicated in that. How have you changed since then? Are you ultra paranoid? Do you take certain precautions you didn't used to? And should journalists and everyone else take the same precautions?
Yeah, I mean, when Snowden first contacted me, he was, for very obvious reasons, extremely reluctant to tell me anything about why he was contacting me. Especially without using encryption. So it was almost like a crazy person had showed up in my inbox, which happens to me with great regularity as a journalist. And he was essentially just saying, I have a huge story for you, but I can't tell you what it is. And before I can talk to you, I need you to spend the next, 5 days of your life installing extremely sophisticated encryption technology so that I can safely communicate with you. And I was saying, okay, I'll totally do that. And then just, went back to work. Because I was actually the one who was naive. I mean, I didn't at the time, like virtually anybody on the earth, realize the extent to which the internet had been converted into a realm of literally limitless surveillance. And of course, not only going through these documents for the last 2.5 years and doing this reporting, but also becoming the target of all sorts of governments and non-state actors to read my emails and to invade my communications. As you saw, my partner was detained at Heathrow Airport for 9 hours under terrorism law, and when he sued the UK government, they had to justify why they detained him, and they essentially said, we knew in advance that he was going to Berlin to visit Laura Poitras, and that would likely be carrying materials relating to this reporting, which they could have only known by reading our emails and listening to our chats. And so knowing that you're a surveillance target, of course, you act then to protect your communications. And I think, there are all kinds of professions who now have the duty, the obligation, to inform themselves about how to safeguard confidentiality. If you're somebody who's a physician or a lawyer or a human rights activist or a journalist, anyone who does any work that owes a duty of confidentiality to other people, you have the absolute obligation to learn how to protect your communications. And there are millions of people around the world as a result of this reporting who are now doing that, who, like me, didn't think to do it before, didn't know how to do it, and now do it. And that, too, is a massive change, not just generally, but for me as well.
Gotcha. So what stories are the media missing right now? What is being not covered as it should, in your opinion? And what is your view of other media types?
I tend not to have the highest opinion of other journalists, although there are a lot of really good ones. But I think the media generally, for reasons that actually Professor Chomsky, has done the best job of outlining, and he did it 25 years ago in a film called Manufacturing Consent, which if you haven't seen, you absolutely should see. There are very narrow narratives that are permitted in most mainstream media outlets, and that's why independent media or independent theaters like this one are so critical for allowing these kind of ideas that don't typically get heard to be heard. And the point that I have always been most astonished by, obviously there's been a big debate about the balance between security on the one hand and privacy and civil liberties on the other. And there's oftentimes this notion that they're in conflict even when they're really not. But people have reasonably different ideas about how that balance should be struck and how much privacy they're willing to give up in the name of security and all of that. And that's fine. People can absolutely debate that. But what has always been sort of the superseding issue for me, and I remember the first time I read through the archive that Snowden provided, what struck me the most was not the extent to which privacy was being subverted by what was being done as reflected in these documents, but the extent to which democracy was being subverted. Because what was amazing to me was that the US government had decided to take this extraordinarily consequential step, which was to convert the internet, which is easily one of the most important human innovations in centuries, and convert it into a realm of ubiquitous surveillance. And you can think that that's a good thing to do or not a good thing to do, but what's so striking about it is that they did it in total secrecy, without any of us having any inkling that they were doing it. And if we allow our government to make the most consequential decisions completely in the dark with no transparency and no public debate, we can go to the ballot box every 2 years or 4 years and check a box next to a party or a name, but the democracy we have is totally illusory. And so for me, what I always think has been suppressed the most is that no matter what you think of Edward Snowden, no matter what you think of security and privacy, I can't imagine that there's anybody who would ever say we would be better off if Edward Snowden had allowed us to remain totally ignorant about what our government is doing. We should all think that that's better.
Okay. Well, let's let the audience ask you some questions, shall we? That's probably much better. Gentleman in front.
Do you know of any bad guys that have actually been caught by government surveillance? Clearly, they're still doing bad things all over the world.
Okay, so the question was, are there any bad guys who've actually been caught by government surveillance?
First of all, one of the things that struck me the most, I've read through many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of top secret documents over the last 2.5 years, and the percentage of those documents that talk about surveillance that actually have anything to do with terrorism is shockingly minute. There's tons of documents about spying for economic purposes, on financial targets, on environmental conferences, for diplomatic advantage, on entire populations, but there's very little that actually has to do with spying in order to find terrorists. And you don't even have to take my word for that when there have been court cases that were triggered by this reporting, when there have been government commissions to investigate the surveillance programs, they've all of them have said that the NSA and the Justice Department and the Pentagon are completely incapable of identifying any terrorist plots that have actually been disrupted as a result of mass surveillance. And the reason for that is actually pretty fascinating. If you think about it, as I said earlier, there's always this idea that security and privacy are in conflict. And the more security you want, the more privacy you have to give up, the more surveillance you have to let the government do, and vice versa. And it really isn't true. If you have a government that is collecting billions of emails and telephone calls every single day, billions with a B every day as they're doing, it becomes almost impossible for them to find the person who's going to detonate bombs at the Boston Marathon, or who wants to blow up a jetliner over Detroit on Christmas Day, or attack a newspaper in Paris, or blow up a subway, an airport in Brussels. You have so much data that you're collecting, and it's so indiscriminate that it's actually harder to achieve the goals that you claim to want to be achieving, which is detecting terrorist plots. And that's the key differences between mass surveillance, on the one hand, which is what they're doing, putting entire populations under a monitoring microscope without suspicion, and targeted surveillance where you're actually tracking the terrorists. And the reason they're doing it poorly isn't because they're stupid. Like, if I know that, they know that. It's because the goal of this surveillance mechanism is much different than their stated goal. If their stated goal were to find terrorists, they would be doing the focused form of terrorism, but that is not their goal with this machine.
Okay. Another question. Oh, let's see here. Student? Yeah, what's your question?
They said that's not a goal. I would like to know what is the goal if you don't let that person.
So what is the goal of the government then?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say what the goal of an entity as huge as the government is, right? Like, you can say, what was the goal in invading Iraq? And it's really nothing that you can ever answer definitively, because there's so many factions that had so many different objectives with why Iraq was invaded, that you could never identify a single motive with clarity. That I can tell you a lot of the motives. For one thing, there's $75 billion spent every single year. And most of that goes to private corporations, private consulting firms. Enormous profit is made from maintaining a system of ubiquitous surveillance. For another, if you are competing in a global economic marketplace, the ability to spy on the Brazilian oil company Petrobras, which is one of the stories that we revealed, or to spy on economic conferences. So when you're negotiating trade agreements with other countries, to be able to have access to their communications internally where they're planning on their negotiating strategy and what their bottom line is, gives you enormous economic advantage. But most importantly, if you look at how governments have used surveillance, mass surveillance in the past, the motive is very clear, which is when you can put an entire population, your own population, under this scrutinizing microscope, and you know what they're planning and what they're doing and with whom they're associating and how they're behaving, you vest in yourself enormous power, especially if you, at the same time that you're knowing everything about the population over which you're ruling, you're building a higher and higher brick wall around yourself to make sure that they know nothing about what you're doing. If you think about like what happens in an ideal free society, the population should know virtually everything about what the government is doing. That's why they're called public officials, because, or they act in the public sphere because they're supposed to have transparency. And conversely, the population, the private citizens, should be able to be engaging in behavior with virtually no monitoring, which is why we're called private citizens. We're operating in the private realm. That's the ideal framework in a free society. In a tyrannical society, the exact opposite takes place, which is the people who exercise power do so with almost no transparency and complete secrecy, while at the same time the population becomes completely transparent. It's just a framework for vesting the people who control this surveillance system with greater and greater power. It's just a very banal and common and primitive drive, which is the drive to maximize one's own power.
Oh, let's see here. I was looking in back. Anyone out back? Oh, with the phone. Shout it.
Hi, I'm also a student reporter, and we want to be good journalists. We don't want to be bad journalists like the ones that you don't like. I just want to know, what sort of attitude do you need to have to want to make the world a better place as a journalist?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. So I would say two things. Number one is I assume that anybody who goes into journalism, like anybody who chooses any kind of profession, whether it's law or writing or medicine or anything, has some sort of passion that in the first instance drives them to choose that. And a lot of times what these fields of discipline are intended to do when you go and actually get out of school and go to work is they're intended to completely snuff that passion out of you. Because that passion gets in the way of you following some sort of dictates. And I think it's really critical to be aware of what that passion is that drove you to want to do this in the first place, and to keep that always really vibrant and not let anybody try and suffocate it out of you. And then specifically with regard to journalism, you know, if you look at the reason why there was a free press that was protected in the Constitution in the first place, there was a really good reason for it. It wasn't supposed to be this kind of cloistered profession called journalists. The free press was this thing that citizens were supposed to use in order to provide a check on those who wield power. So when people in power say something, you can use a free press to counter it, to negate it, to investigate it, to scrutinize it, to subject it to critical skepticism. That's what journalism is really intended to be. That's when it's worth protecting, is when it becomes an adversarial force against those who wield the greatest power. And so often journalism becomes the opposite. It becomes a servant of power. It becomes about amplifying the message of those who wield power, because there's a lot of benefits from expressing servitude to power. That's the nature of power, is when you wield power, you can reward those who are obedient and punish those who aren't. And I think that the idea of journalism in its most constructive form is when you're shining a light on what people in power are trying to maintain a wall of darkness around, when you're exposing their lies, when you're preventing them from exercising authority without any limits of any kind. And you know, Edward Snowden, when he decided which journalists he wanted to work with, the ordinary thing for him to have done would have been to go to the New York Times. That's what national security whistleblowers for many decades have just automatically done. And he purposely chose to stay as far away from the New York Times as possible, because there have been so many instances where they have concealed stories from their own readers because the government asked them to or told them to. And he trusted us that once he gave us this material, that no matter what threats we were subjected to, no matter what forms of persuasion were directed at us, no matter how much effort there was to say that we were endangering security or we would have blood on our hands if we disclosed it, that we would follow this adversarial ethos of journalism and be the adversary of government. And to me, that's the real spirit of journalism when it actually serves the public interest.
Eeny, meeny, miny. Oh, okay, right there in front. Yes, go ahead. So, as a journalist, what do you decide what to share with the public and what not to?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question, and it's one that actually Edward Snowden thought a lot about before he came to us. You know, a lot of times people ask us, you know, look, he gave you hundreds of thousands of documents. Why haven't you just released it all to the public? Why have you taken your time and sort of done it story by story? And one of the main reasons is because he was insistent upon that. He actually demanded that as a condition to giving us these materials. I mean, if he wanted nothing more than just all of the material he had to just be uploaded to the internet, trust me, he wouldn't have needed to call me to help him do that. He was very capable of doing that on his own. What he wanted instead was for us to go through the material and be very meticulous about making judgments about which material needed to get into the public in order to inform the public so that the public could have a reasoned debate, and it would be the public to decide what kinds of government they wanted, how much privacy they were willing to give up, rather than having a small number of people do that in secret. But at the same time, he wanted us to make sure that we weren't harming people. There's a lot of material that if we publish would harm people's privacy. It talks about their private communications. It speculates about things that they may or may not have done. There's material that might help other governments better spy on their own citizens if we were to publish really detailed blueprints of how the spying system is built and how it's constructed and how it functions. It could help other people build similar forms of surveillance and therefore increase surveillance. And so we try to maintain this balance with every single decision we've made about which stories we were going to publish to make sure that there was a real public interest to it, that innocent people wouldn't be harmed, and that we wouldn't end up inadvertently helping other people subject their populations to surveillance. As time goes by, and we're 2.5 years later now, our standards for publishing have actually decreased. We're willing to publish more now. And so we're looking for ways to sort of bulk publish, get more of the information out to the public. But we try to be extremely scrupulous about the reporting, in part because our source wanted it, in part because if we hadn't been scrupulous, if we had made mistakes and released information that harmed innocent people, that would be a huge favor to the US government to distract attention away from the reporting, to discredit it. And also because I just think our duty morally as not just journalists but as citizens is not to do anything that might harm people who have done nothing wrong. And so it's just been this really complicated balancing act, but I think we had really strong ethical duties in lots of different ways to engage in it.
Good question. We'll do one more question, but this isn't your last opportunity for questions. In fact, if you like, you can go online and submit questions that will be asked perhaps tomorrow at tomorrow night's session. If you go to the College of Social and Behavioral Science website, you can actually enter your own questions and vote on other questions. So I encourage you to do that and ask your question that doesn't get asked today. Let's go right here, ma'am. Go ahead.
I want to say how much I admire you and Professor Chomsky, and I'm very grateful for your work. My question is fairly unusual. It only relates to your movie in regards to a story that has not broken. So I'm speaking for other people who are being heard. And so my question is, do you know what organized stalking is? Okay, thank you. And do you know how to get it into the mainstream media?
I mean,
So the question was, do you know what organized stalking is? And
We can't break it to the mainstream.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's one of the difficulties that other whistleblowers have had, not just from the NSA, but from other government agencies, is that if you come forward and make claims about what the government is doing and don't have documents to prove it, it's very difficult to have credibility in what you're saying. And the NSA is this massive, sprawling entity. And Edward Snowden took as many documents as he took, still a tiny sliver of documents about what they were doing. So we've gone through the documents really carefully. We've shared them with a couple of other news organizations, and we've more or less reported on all of the really big stories that we think these documents demonstrate. I have no doubt, and I think this is ultimately the greatest value of Edward Snowden, is not specifically the documents that he revealed. It's instead this template that we tried to create where we think that courage is contagious, and that by seeing Edward Snowden do what he did and come forward and not end up in an orange jumpsuit and chains and shackles and then put into a cage in the United States for the rest of his life, but instead having this relatively fulfilled life, that it will inspire and encourage other people inside the government to similarly come forward when they see illegal or improper or anti-democratic acts taking place as well. And there's already been some whistleblowers who have come forward inspired by him, and I have no doubt that just like he was inspired by Thomas Drake and William Binney and Daniel Ellsberg before him, that there will be others who follow as well, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more revelations like that.
Glenn, do you have any projects coming out we should watch for? Books, movies, things that we can expect from you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm working on a bunch of things. I won't bore anybody with self-promotion, but it's been this experience of doing this reporting has enabled me to start a new media organization with Laura and our colleague Jeremy Scahill, who's a brilliant investigative journalist. And we've tried to sort of replicate the journalism that we were able to do here by building this new media organization, and that's where most of my energy goes to.
And of course, Oliver Stone has a movie on Snowden coming out this year. Anything else we can expect?
Yeah, Oliver actually does have a film that is now done, and it's a biography of Snowden, though it focuses on the meeting that Laura and I had and the work that we did with him. And there's another film as well based on the book that I wrote that will also be coming out at some point, probably at the end of 2016.
So a movie, No Place to Hide?
No Place to Hide, yeah, that's the working title. And, you know, I think it's really great because there are a lot of people who aren't going to go online and read stories about surveillance, but they will watch, you know, an Oliver Stone film or a Sony film, and with popular entertainment like Laura's film as well, you reach huge numbers of people. And ultimately, that's what Edward Snowden came forward to do, was to essentially, you know, in some sense, wake people up who were sleeping, not through any fault of their own, but because so much of what's done is designed to lure them to sleep by making them aware, not just of the secret acts of the United States government and other governments, but also ultimately, and I hope this is the message that people walk away from more than anything else, is to awaken their sense of power as an individual. Because that to me is the greatest lesson that I personally learned from working with Snowden, and I think you see from this film, which is, if you think about it, and this is really remarkable, you know, Edward Snowden, at the time that we met him, he was 29 years old, and he was somebody who grew up in a lower middle class environment. His father was in the Coast Guard for 30 years. He didn't even graduate high school. He was this obscure employee in a sprawling, you know, military-industrial complex at the NSA, the CIA, Booz Allen. He was somebody without any power or position or prestige of any kind, and yet through nothing more than an act of courage and an act of conscience, you know, he changed the world. He did, and I think that a lot of times for those of us politically interested and engaged, it's really easy to give into this defeatism and, you know, to say, I see all these injustices, but I just am too powerless. The forces arrayed against me are too powerful. I can't really do anything about it. And there's a lot of people throughout history who were previously obscure, who through an act of bravery changed the world like he did. And I think that's really the lesson that he taught more than anything else, is not these specific revelations about the NSA, but the power of the individual through an act of moral conscience to stand up to institutional injustice.
Well, thank you, Glenn Greenwald. We'll see you again tomorrow night, 5 o'clock, Centennial Hall, or online at the Intercept website. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate it.
Enjoy